Well, good afternoon, good evening, and good morning to all of you, wherever you are joining us for the final session for this session of the Publication Integrity Week 2024. My name is Anubhav Pradhan, and I hope I am audible and visible to all of you. In case I am not, please let me know in the comment box. I'm going to be moderating this session. Allow me to please quickly share my slides with you. So I hope my screen is also visible right now. The title of this session is Dealing with Data, Interpretation of Qualitative Data. As I said, my name is Anubhav Pradhan. I am a member of the COPE Council. I am also an assistant professor with the Department of Liberal Arts at the Indian Institute of Technology, Bhilai, which is based in Chhattisgarh in central India. Sheetal Patil is the League of Academics and Research with the School of Environment and Sustainability at the Indian Institute for Human Settlements in Bangalore, India. She has training in economics and has been doing field-based research in agricultural systems for many decades now. Shika is interested in issues related to sustainability in agriculture, especially in rural and marginal farms in India and similar climatic conditions. Thank you very much, Shika, for joining us, taking out time. We also have Pritish Behera, who's a program manager with the Foundation for Ecological Security in India. Pritish is based out of the Chhattisgarh office of the Foundation for Ecological Security. He's had multiple leadership roles across academia, government engagement, and eco-restoration. His area of expertise lies in strategic action, policy analysis and development, project management, and research governance and organization, and system change analysis. Just to set a quick note of introduction for what we are going to be discussing in this session, there is a great amount of data which is gathered in the social sciences and humanities, especially, which refers to people's experiences or people's information. Right? This is somewhat different from what is the kind of data which is gathered in clinical studies or trials. And our attempt here today is to think about how do we ethically gather data in the social sciences, in humanities? What are the challenges in working with data? And how do we think about ethically bringing that out as research publications, as journal editors, as working professionals, as research scholars and professors? So I request Sheetal to start with the presentation and then we move on to Pritish. Thank you, Sheetal.
Thank you so much, Anubhav, and for that kind introduction. Thanks to Anubhav, thanks to COPE, thanks to everybody listening in here today. As Anubhav said, my name is Sheetal. I lead research. I'm a lead researcher at IIHS in the School of Environment and Sustainability. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit on what are the different steps and challenges on, when you deal with qualitative data, when you deal with qualitative analysis, or when you deal with the interpretation of the analysis with using the qualitative data that you have gathered. So somewhat it will touch upon the ethics part, but more of the times I will give the steps and challenges and all that, so that it becomes clearer about how it is connected with ethics. So I'll start with some slides that I have right now, and then maybe when I finish presenting the slides, I'll be happy to take any questions or clarifications that audience may have. I hope everything is visible on the screen as the first slide, and I'll just go and jump into the topic. So as I said, I'm going to talk about the qualitative data analysis, and incidentally, I will cover a little bit of a ethics part while doing the data analysis and interpretation. I will show this slide first, and many a times I think you have seen this slide and also understood what is the meaning of it, right? So many of the times the qualitative researchers face similar kind of a challenge. When you have an object or something that you are trying to study, you will see it from very different perspectives and different angles, and you will see it as a different thing every time. This is exactly what happens in the qualitative research. And what do we mean by qualitative research? It is something which actually has features and entities and qualities of certain things, as opposed to quantitatives, where there is a lot of measurements and difference in amount. Qualitative research emphasizes on the qualities and on the processes and meanings that are not experimentally examined or measured. And they are associated with the interpretive perspective in social research largely, not so much to test out given theories, but to appreciate the underlying motivations that people have for doing what they are doing. It also studies things in their natural settings. And it is for many different purposes. One of them is about to understand the meaning that people have of the world around them, as these meanings tend to govern their actions, right? So we have seen in lots of our research projects that every time we ask a different question, the meaning changes, and similarly, the world around them, the worldview changes, right? It also identifies meanings in kind of people, kind of actions, kind of beliefs and interests they have, differences in the forms of actions, which lead to differences in meanings. And also, it brings out or creates narratives about reporting what particular people do in everyday lives and what their actions mean to themselves and to the surroundings that they are part of. And uh, as I said, there are these features of qualitative research, which is, it's very specific, having specific rationale for choosing qualitative approach, because not every study should be taken as a qualitative inquiry. So researchers choose generally qualitative methods when they seek to gain deeper understanding of the problem or a phenomenon. Also, it is diverse disciplinary perspective when we want to study these diversity and how it changes perspective with respect to the change in disciplinary expertise. That is when the qualitative research draws on ideas from various disciplines such as sociology, anthropology, psychology, education, and so on. This diversity provides actually a broader lens for studying complex human interactions and cultural practices. Many a times, language in qualitative research really plays a crucial role because it serves as a primary medium of collecting and analyzing data, right? You do interviews in certain language, you collect narratives. There are observations which are narrated in certain languages, and they rely very heavily on verbal and non-verbal communications. Researchers also pay attention to how languages shape meanings, reveal cultural values, and reflect social dynamics and all that. So the fourth one is about the relationship between researcher and what is studied, right? So that is what actually also defines the selection of qualitative research method. The researchers is deeply involved in the study. They interact closely with participants. They build trust and rapport to gather authentic insights. And this relationship is very crucial in understanding the participants' perspective and ensuring ethical considerations are met. So that is where the ethical considerations and ethical challenges also comes into picture. Like, we are so close to the respondent, close to the subject that we are actually studying. Sometimes it becomes really problematic for a researcher to whether to how to sympathize, how to kind of be removed from the subject, but actually have a clear critical inquiry without losing any ethical concept, without losing any ethical kind of boundaries. Uh, there are also other things like, unique design and approaches which qualitative research provides, which has a flexible and adaptive designs. Unlike, structured qualitative studies, quantitative studies, qualitative research evolves how the study progresses. There are so many techniques that are grounded on theory, ethnography, and case studies, narrative analysis, which allows to tailor all the methods that the researcher wants to fit their research context and making it uniquely situated in the context where they are going to nuance their findings from this study. So if if somebody decides to have a qualitative research, that means it demands that it should not be viewed as an easy substitute to statistical or quantitative analysis. It is not a substitute. It is totally different kind of a method, and it has its key features also. And it meant for a researcher who is willing to do all these things. What are those? Commit to extensive time in the field, engage in complex, time-consuming processes of data analysis, write long passages, because mostly the interviews are in a narrative format, so it takes a long time to transcribe the interviews, which means writing of the long passages and all that. And participate in the form of social and human science research. So that does not have the firm guidelines, like it, that is how I said it evolves. It kind of takes a different kind of shape and scale as the research, qualitative research gets evolved and progresses. So many a times when we have all this data, when we collect everything that we want from the study, what do we do with all that data? So it is same as numerical statistical tests. There are many options in qualitative data analysis. There are different ways in which it can be analyzed. And quickly, let's look at some of the steps in which this qualitative data analysis progresses. It means that imagining cleaning up your wardrobe or a closet, right? Like take everything out, sort everything out, save or throw some things, see what is left and organize it, and again into subgroupings, which we call it in the qualitative data analysis terms chunking. Then organize those subgroups into clusters, which means, or which we call it as clusters or codes. And while putting everything back, group them to maximize the functionality and learn how do these groups make it work together. Like, that is how interpretation and representation happens. That is where you will see your wardrobe as stacked with different kind of subgroups of clusters, and that is where the functionality comes into picture. There are 4 basic steps in the qualitative data analysis, which involves raw data management. When you collect all the data in your narrative forms, you manage it by cleaning it periodically. You have 2 levels of data reduction. One is chunking and another one is coding. One is like chuck what you don't need, and make the stacks of similar things and then code them. That is the second step of data reduction. Data interpretation is nothing but again coding and clustering. So make similar codes into one cluster to say that this is the theme emerging from those codes. And then the data interpretation and representation, which is mostly in terms of telling the story, making sense of data for others, and those kind of things. And mostly the ethical considerations are observed, or challenges are faced in first and the last stage of this data collection and analysis stage, right? So you can actually guess what it is when I meant that first and last stage has mostly the ethical considerations. The second thing is, what is the key objective of interpretation? Like when the last stage is there, that we have to interpret the data, you have to represent it in a certain format. What does it mean? Why do we do it? We do it first to extract meaning from the data. For example, when analyzing interview data about workplace satisfaction, for example, when researchers might focus on both the explicit statements and the tone or hesitation in participants' answers, which could reveal hidden concerns or feelings, but that too with very ethical kind of considerations. The second is identify patterns and themes. For instance, one of the example could be if participant in a study on education repeatedly mentions that teacher support, which means it is as critical factor for success. This could emerge as a key theme in that research and recognize that this pattern is crucial for understanding broader trend in the data. Then the third is link data to research questions. Another example, it could be like in a study where investigation of impact of social media on mental health is being done. So the researcher must link participants' experience, such as feelings of isolation or comparison, to the broader question of how social media affects emotional well-being. This connection ensures that the research remains goal-oriented and not purposeful, because many a times this is what ethical consideration comes into picture, and we may have some kind of a purpose in doing our whatever motive, but our goal is to understand actually what are these different nuances of impacts coming from the participants' views. The fourth and the last thing is generating insights for decision making, which becomes really crucial because such interpretation could mean certain changes in policies, certain changes in schemes, or support for certain things. For example, insights from a study on a community health might lead to recommendation for improving local healthcare service or a policy. By providing the practical solution, qualitative research becomes a powerful tool for driving such changes, right? So, in short, qualitative research interpretation is a process that goes beyond only organizing the data. It seeks to uncover the meaning, identify patterns, link findings to research question, and also to generate actionable kind of pointers and insights for either policy or any other kind of intervention, right? So of these objectives, they play a critical role in ensuring that research process is thorough, it is meaningful, it is relevant to the real world, and it applies, it has the applications also in the real world. And by fulfilling these objectives, qualitative research can provide very rich understanding of human experience and also contribute valuable kind of knowledge to a wide range of fields, not only just the social or humanities, but also to many other domains of research. Now, very quickly, going into the considerations of ethics in qualitative data analysis and interpretation, these seem very mundane and a list of, as a bucket list of things that you have to take care while you do, qualitative data analysis or interpretation, but it has a deep meaning when you actually start doing it, right? So it dwells because the data dwells and the research, the qualitative research dwells deeper into the thoughts, emotions, and experiences of individual. Having these ethical considerations as a critical aspect of the process is very important. The analysis and interpretation of qualitative data often involves very sensitive and personal information, which requires researchers to uphold the high ethical standards to ensure trust, fairness, and integrity. And below, these are kind of some of the things which many of us know. But just to give some examples, because everything could be understood with a really good live examples that we have experienced many a times while doing the research. First one is protecting participants' privacy, which is, for example, removing identifiable details from any quotes that you will do in your transcripts, or just using pseudonyms, which can help maintain the confidentiality. Because breaching the privacy could harm the participants emotionally or socially, making it crucial to handle data with care, right? Another one is informed consent. This is for every researcher, whether it is qualitative or quantitative, is utmost important, right? If researcher decide to use the participant data in a different study later, they also must seek additional consent. It is not only just for this study, but for example, if it is going beyond this study and use the data for another study, that also need to be included in the consent format, right? Without informed consent, the trust could be breach between the researcher and participant, and it could be really damaging to the entire study and its credibility. The third is avoid misinterpretations, right? Which is nothing but, for example, selectively quoting participant or taking their statements out of context can lead to very inaccurate kind of a conclusion. This is not unethical, but it also reduces the validity of the research, and it really brings the rigor of the study into question. Minimizing harm, transparency in reporting. It has a lot of examples, but I'm just jumping into some of the other sensitive issues, something like, how do you balance subjectivity and objectivity? For example, if the researcher is studying cultural practice, which they are not familiar with, it's completely new to them, right? They have to take care that they have to receive this information about certain cultural practices with cautious and without any judgment. Respecting these participants' viewpoints will ensure that you are ethical, and accurate kind of a representation of data will take place when you come to an end of analysis. Which brings into cultural sensitivity also, right? Like certain norms and certain understandings and practices within the cultural groups should be understood with their own perceptions. And if we fail to do that, it could result into a very biased kind of a conclusions. So cultural sensitivity is really essential for building trust and ensuring that respectful analysis will take place in your study later on. Fairness of data use, we know about it. Data security, we also know about it, because we really put down all these things into our proposals or consent forms, saying that we will use the data, we'll keep it secured, it will not be shared, it will be locked, all those kind of things. So these should be really clearly practiced, and to make it kind of an unbiased study. Another very important thing, which is last in this list, is about reciprocity and participant benefit. Like many of the times when we are at the end of the research, or we have completed the research, we generally forget to feedback on whatever we have found to our participants who have shared so much valuable kind of information to us to bring the research to that stage. So, for example, sharing of the findings with participants or using the research to advocate for policy change in their favor can demonstrate this reciprocity. Or, ethical research actually recognizes the value of participants' contribution, and it seeks to give back to the community in a very meaningful ways. So these are some of the considerations for ethics and practices for analysis and interpretation. There are some examples of how it is done, in the sense that not really taking the ethics into consideration, but I don't want to go into this in much detail. But when I maybe, just talk about something in the last about, what are these processes of how do you progress the data analysis into coding and thematic kind of a structure to your coding. It becomes in this fashion, like, it goes from descriptive to interpretative to pattern of coding, which means that you are extracting summary from all your notes which were in a descriptive format. It could mean that, some of the, I have given the example of an interview of uh, career path or career trajectory of a person who is willing to who has actually registered himself into a doctorate program, and after a long time he was actually doubting whether he should be doing the doctorate program or no. And that script which is there on your left box is actually gone through all these process of chunking to coding, or how do you cluster the codes, and how do you find thematics from those clusters. um, and then last step is about data interpretation and finding out themes, right? So that becomes more important, because that is where the subjectivity can creep in, and that is where the ethical uh, slippery kind of a slope for ethical consideration can begin from there, from the interpretation itself. um, yeah, I'm not going into details into that process itself, but I hope that I have done kind of little bit uh, informative for how do we really consider ethics into our research, qualitative research. Thanks, and I'm happy to take questions or clarifications later on.
Thank you very much, Sheetal. This was a very informative and enriching discussion. As Sarah has also put in the chat box, any questions for the speakers can be put in the Q&A box, and we can take them up later, or we can also, I try to type my responses to them also. We move on to Pritish for your presentation now. Thank you.
Yes. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Greetings and good evening from India. Thank you, Anubhav and Co, for this opportunity. Before I share the slides, I'll just add on to the introduction that Anubhav did give. I'm currently looking after the monitoring and evaluation, part of an organization called Foundation for Ecological Security. And before that, I have been part of a government corporation in India, which also I looked at a large scale social development program that was run across the country. And I've also been, my day-to-day work also includes I meet a lot of coalitions, a lot of networks, a lot of groups. I meet a lot of government, different stakeholders, philanthropic organizations, and academic institutions. And I come from a space where it is where I straddle both academic and a practitioner space. So I'll try to give an angle of how practitioners look at ethics, and while we deal with large amounts of data that is generated across our work. So just allow me a moment so that I can share the slides. Let me just give as to how I'm going to tackle this particular section. So I'll talk about our organization a bit as to what space that we work. I'll also I'll also look at how philanthropy funded initiatives work, as we call in non-governmental organization. We'll look at how government departments work in terms of qualitative data and data as such, and and the challenges that we face in terms of looking at or treating ethics or ethical practices in publishing all of that data that is collected or reported. And we'll also look at overall as to how what are the implications in terms of publishing all of this data. Uh, so um, I work with an organization called Foundation for Ecological Security. It's a non-profit organization, which basically is an organization that operates very differently from a government, and has a very very specific humanitarian, social, and developmental objective. And we FES basically works in the space of eco restoration, so that in the conservation of land, forest and water resources in the country. We believe that giving tenure rights to people, collective action, access to resources for people who are marginalized, can really help in restoring the ecological health of of the land that they take up, and also towards resilient livelihoods. Let's talk a bit about what are philanthropy funded initiatives or non-governmental organizations. NGOs work on funds provided by philanthropic organizations, including large bank foundations, and these organizations and these funds are uh, and the areas of work are very specific, which are collaboratively decided between who is funding and where the NGO is working, and also around current issues in terms of social and developmental issues that are there in the landscape. And these so the programs that they decide to work on are designed to tackle specific social issues with very specific time bound objectives and outcomes. And this particular and it is also preceded by a very long process of designing the program, where a lot of stakeholders they participate, and where the objectives, outcomes, and what all benefits that the beneficiaries will get, or how the landscape will be benefited by the initiatives, is also laid out on the table. Um, Monitoring and evaluation structures are prerequisites of any program that is implemented in any landscape, wherever philanthropic organizations, NGOs, or other stakeholders are included. So the outcomes and outputs are monitored, tracked, and there's a big focus on also to track and report the impact that happens after all of this work is implemented on the ground, and to figure out what are the changes that are happening of the landscape. So outcomes are so now coming to the outcomes, and the outcomes and the impact that happens in this particular landscape or wherever they are working. They are reported at various platforms, including publications, annual reports and program reports, which gets consumed by a lot of other stakeholders across which also forms the genesis of further interventions in that particular landscape. Now, in this particular context, how does the ethical concerns come in? As I said, that a lot of data is generated, a lot of reports, impact reports. There are publications that are happening. There are a lot of policy that is also happening because of the work that is being done by NGOs and philanthropic organizations. So how does let's see how does that ethical section comes in. It's quite it's been observed that there's an absence of operationalizing ethical concerns at the genesis or inception of the program design. It's So ethical, and because a lot of this work happens on communities, on which are human participants, in terms of interventions that happen within the community, and data that is collected to track and compile the outcomes and the impact. Ethical concerns is more or less is absent while we are looking at while the program is being designed, or the design, or whenever the program is implemented on the ground. The primacy of achieving the outcomes of the program sometimes undermines the monitoring and evaluation processes. Um, uh, so uh, it's been so in the current scenario, achieving the results, achieving the goals, and how do we get to the outcomes as soon as possible. There's an intense focus on outcomes, which really sometimes undermines the monitoring and evaluation process, because monitoring and evaluation process are a very slow and an intensive process. Where you're looking at every other possible way to validate and reinforce your processes, so that whatever you're collecting is reliable. Uh, uh, Also, so there is a case of tacit trust and cases of personal privacy and disclosure. Organizations that are working on the ground or with the community and for a very long time tend to and build a relationship of trust, which Sheetal just pointed in one of her slides. Where there is a relationship between the researcher and the participant. So that trust also sometimes undermines the whole ethical undermines the ethical process of how we collect data, wherein videos, photos, and a lot of community or household or personal data are just shared, just because there's a trust between the implementer, who's been working with that community for a long time, and the participant or the beneficiary who's there. So and those particular documents, videos, photos, and cases, they're also reported, but the reported without those ethical concerns being taken into place or taken into consideration. Now, this reporting of all of the data that is collected, the reporting of data, it seems that the ethical part is only limited to a consent form, and also as an afterthought. While it comes to a stage where we are looking at while we want to report that program benefits or the impact, while, as I said, the ethical concerns is not inbuilt into the program, but is very limited to a consent form, which could be simple and complex depending on which side of which side you're looking at. It could be a very simple form if you're looking at from a data collection point, but looking at how do the participant or the community comprehend the consent form is also something that that needs to be researched. As I said, outcomes currently they shape public policy, and there is this huge intense focus where outcomes has been the only thing that shapes public policy. But how is that data collected? How did we reach that outcome? Did we look at the whole ethical process in terms of data collection, as Sheetal mentioned, and that's not really looked at, which makes it a very kind of a utilitarian model that we are looking at in that sense. Now I'll just talk about a little about how what government departments are and how do they operate. So government is built on the foundation of public service principles of integrity, being impartial, to be professional, to be diverse, being responsible, being accountable, and also to be very transparent. The government is also responsible for setting examples of governance structures and processes. So governance processes structures basically tells us how do we manage any structure that is there, government structure, how it should manage, and how it can be a efficient and effective vehicle for all the programs to be delivered, all the programs benefits to get to the last mile. This is how governance are, and government is supposed to be the epitome of how governance should happen. Government also implements large scale, pan-national programs, which happens at the same time, which means that they scale those programs at the same time, where every other cohort of every other person demographic profile that they select gets the program at the same time. So it's very large scale. And government is also responsible to devise and draft policies which affect millions of people. So this is how the scale of work that the government works on. And looking in that perspective, it goes without saying that large amount of data, both qualitative and quantitative, is collected and reported. So now let's look at what are the challenges when you are looking at government departments working. So there's a glaring lack of narrative around ethics in the government structures. I'm not even talking about having ethical procedures. Some of them have, but in all the interactions that I've been part of in the last in 10, 15 years, it's glaring that there's a lack of narrative, around ethical concerns when we look at government structures across. Also that uh, and there's the large scale data collection, and there's a large scale of data that is collected and consumed at different structures, different hierarchies of the government, with very negligible ethical consideration. So the f- so the so the focus is always on the outcomes and outputs and what impact that the program happened, where they do check by collecting data from the community, but then there is negligible ethical validation. I don't even see a process put in place, and there could be small islands where it could be happening, but I see very negligible data validation processes that are happening, and lack of reflexivity. So unless until data collection, reporting, and unless until we reflect, because uh, if we there's a lot of power dynamics within when the government is collecting data, when data is being reported from the ground, but then critical reflective process around this data collection process will may also look at may also show up lot of power dynamics, lot of as I said, lot of access, lot of functions of how people are accessing data. It could be a function of what are the narratives that are going around. So there's a clear lack of reflexivity within the government procedures in terms of how do we look at ethical procedures when we are reporting large scale data, which sometimes includes personal data of households. Now, now there's a clear there's a clear explanation that sometimes the government structures or organizations say, and the word is intent. Now, intent is a word which is parroted, saying that if the intent is right, then we can definitely go ahead and do everything, and ethics sometimes takes a back seat. And I think it's a very poor substitute for the lack of ethical structures, and in terms of how the data is collected and reported. But this is something that is it's very visible with the organizations and government often saying that we just want to do good. But I think that's a very poor excuse to not looking at ethical concerns. Now, in terms of the whole whole space, or the whole thing that I drawed in in terms of philanthropic organizations and government looking and consuming large scale data. So what are the challenges that I see around publishing of these data in terms of reports, annual reports, policies that are there? I say in sense that public policy is built on long-term research across many stakeholders, and I believe there is a lack of accountability on the published content and the policies that are followed. So I see that this lack of accountability is quite visible, wherein it's not really clear who's the owner, who are we supposed to who is accountable to verify that data. So that is something that is a big challenge. The second is basically the objectivity in the published content. So it could be policy papers, annual reports, funder reports, reports to philanthropic organizations. There's a trend towards it being very subjective in nature, and uh, 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 which really brings to the point that it really goes against the grain of what ethics is. It should be very objective. And then responsibility, as Sheetal also mentioned, that how do we use that? How do we share the data? How do we store it? Where are we archiving that data? All the data that is collected, which of human participants, either in research or the large scale baseline data that organizations collect and store. And so there's no responsibility on in terms of there's no clear visible, transparent processes of sharing as to where it is shared or used or stored. And I see that it's the data collection currently when I see within the landscape is very extractive in nature. There's a lot of baseline and a lot of data that is collected from households and human participants and citizens across. But then the authorship is not best, or it's not very clear. It's not evident, and it's not printed as to so I think that's so fairness come to the point that it should be very fair in terms of giving credit where it is due, and giving authorship. And obviously the last point that I can make, which is that there's very there's lack of the processes for publication and collecting of data isn't visible. It's not accessible, and I see a very it's not transparent. So I think I've been able to kind of explain the challenges around from a very practitioner point of view. So I'll be happy to take up questions.
Thank you very much, Pritish. Very informative and enriching lecture also. We're open for questions and discussions. We have a question in the chat box, but before we click up that, I just quickly summarize the discussion that we've had so far. Shika, you introduced what is qualitative research, what are the various ways in which we do qualitative research, and what are the ends to which we also do qualitative research. What does it consist of? I like how you spoke about language and trust as a part of qualitative research, which also reminds us that anything in which you have language is going to be subjective. So the notion that there will be a completely impartial or objective domain of whether it's research or whether it's publication or knowledge is perhaps not very viable. That's my interpretation of what you said. I'm not saying you said that, but that's my interpretation of what you said. I think the emphasis that it's very important to build relationships with participants in all kinds of qualitative research, especially field-based research is a very valuable one. And thank you also for taking us through the various steps in which how the research is conducted, from chunking and coding to clustering and then patterns. Pritish, thank you for sort of laying out the domain in terms of how qualitative research is carried out in the non-profit and the NGO sector, the non-profit and the non-government sector. Sectors which are working largely with various kinds of demographics all over the world to advance, you know, largely to say that to advance empowerment of people, sort of add value to their lives. But it's kind of the behind the scenes of what goes on in how these sectors work and how also government organizations work, and the kind of ways in which data is often gathered and the challenges and lacuna in how data is stored, data is archived, and data is interpreted to come out with policy, to come out with actionable plans. Um, uh, Not a very hopeful picture that we get from the end of your presentation, Pritish, but I know there is still hope in the world. So we move on to the question that we have. I encourage all the participants, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box. We have one question as of now, and any one of you or both of you can answer that. I read it out. Considering the integrity of qualitative research, how do we ensure as objective or neutral interpretation as possible when positing the relevance of small samples in the field of large public arenas?
I'm happy to go first. And Yeah, it's a great question, and that is what I think is one of the very burning kind of a question when somebody decides, some researcher decides to do a qualitative research way, right? And that is when the uh, it's not a tick box where you say that, yeah, I fulfill this, that's why I need to go for a qualitative research, but also considering that, what is your research question? Are you really trying to do this research which draws the interpretation, which is going to be something for the larger population? Then your qualitative research also should have that many kind of a validation points and triangulations which is required. So when we say qualitative research, it is not only just the interview or in-depth kind of a discussion narrative style interviews with participants, but also it involves, say, focus group discussions with different types of stakeholders, or participatory exercises for certain kind of a mapping or assessments. All those take a form of qualitative research methods also, right? But then, yeah, the question of objectivity and neutral kind of interpretation comes into picture when you don't have such triangulating kind of a data points. That is when you try to become subjective, when you have just one kind of data point which talks about certain kind of a stakeholder or a participant that you have interviewed and got data from. So even though there is a small sample in the qualitative research, all these participatory and engaging kind of methods make it to the, not exactly, to the point where the quantitative research brings in the significance level, right? When they do lots of statistical analysis, they talk in terms of, or we, actually, I am also a quantitative person, not forgetting that. We do a lot of interpretation in terms of significance, confidence, this kind of a level of correlation and those kind of things, right? So when you do such methods, combine it and make a triangulation as rigorous as you can, it can actually be equivalent to what the quantitative research could make as an objective interpretation. I hope I have answered that.
Thank you, Sheetal. If you have anything to add to that, Pritish.
Yes, I think I can add. So I think for a qualitative researcher, I think it's very important. The journey starts from inside. I think the qualitative researcher needs to observe him or herself first, right? As to what are his or her thought processes, and are there any biases in it? Number one. Second, I'm talking about that, it's very easy to, when you have small samples, it's very easy to, base your research and be subjective. But I think it's very important that the journey inward should be more often, as to, what are your biases, and biases could be from anything, not necessarily what you see and observe on the ground, but for the space that you're coming from, in terms of, what all literature, what all theories, and what all, academic background that you're coming from, right? So in terms, so that should be, it should, one should very, reflect, number one. Second, that if there are small samples, and we are looking, we're looking to kind of, being very objective, instead of small samples, I believe it has to be iterative process. It can't really be, one visit, and when we do it, and we arrive at the result, but it has to be iterative. Otherwise, unless until we are looking at, as Sheetal pointed out, uh, triangulate it with quantitative data, and but it has to be, if it has to be very strictly qualitative, then I think multiple iterative process in terms of going back to the same community, the same set of people in a different context can help. And the third could be that I can add is, which I am a big fan of, is that to always have memos. Always, write down your observations, write down your interactions, right exactly right after you finish the focus group discussion or interviews and everything else that goes through in a qualitative sphere. So in terms that you're able to actually replicate whatever you observed, whatever you asked, whatever the participant answered, and then you can go back to it after a few days and see whether there were any biases on it, or whether were you coming from a different space, was did you exactly record what they were saying, right, to bringing that objectivity onto it. Yeah, so yeah, that would be my part.
Thank you, Pritish. While we're waiting for other people to think of questions to pose, I was wondering if both of you would like to talk a little more about what Sheetal said, which was about how do you ensure that there are benefits to participants, of participants of qualitative research from the output of that research. Because I think a large majority of our audience, and this is an assumption, may be journal editors. And when we think of research integrity, there's also often the question of conflict of interest. So how do you, I mean, if you could just clarify, how is that not a conflict of interest?
I would
Can I
request
ask
Pritish
you to
first.
repeat the question? Sorry.
Okay, yeah. So I'm saying that Sheetal was pointing out that in doing qualitative research, it's often valuable to also keep in mind what are the benefits which the participants of that research might get from the outputs of that research, from the publication of that research, or from whatever actionable happens in terms of reports or policy papers which are published with that research. So, how is that different from a conflict of interest? We often think of, ensuring that there should not be a conflict of interest when a research study is being undertaken. So, how is this different from a conflict of interest?
So I'll just try to answer this. It seems like a difficult question, but pertinent. Yeah. Um, uh, so um, um, so in terms of when we when the data is collected, at the point when the data is collected, if it's a in a qualitative, so could be an interview or focus group discussion. Uh, so uh, it's very so I see it as a function of how the researcher selects the participants is very important, because if it really so that part sometimes we tend to kind of be a little lenient, because the in data collection is hard. Qualitative data collection is very hard, and finding participants to be a part of your data collection is also very hard, because it's a function of a lot of time that is there, right? So participants have to spend a lot of time with you for you to actually collect rich data. So it's very important that it's very for, the first thing is very important that we select participants who who are who probably have not been part of such exercises before. So sometimes it happens that, if I can take an example of certain communities where a lot of organizations are working, so they could be going to to that community to collect the same kind of data, right? It's not that one organization is working on in a single sphere. Lot of many organizations are working. So it's very important that we select those participants who have not been part of such exercises before. I'm not saying that this has to be it could be written in stone, but it's something that we could actually strive for. This is where rigor comes in. The second is, so therein, when that happens, you generally are able to minimize a bit of the conflict of interest. The second is, in terms of outputs that are there, if if the researcher does a bit of in terms of homework, in terms of what kind of output it does will. So there are different kinds of outputs. One that could be published in a paper. Those sometimes those papers can really not be taken to the participants, right? And sometimes those has to be drafted or molded into a certain way for the participants or the community to consume. Now, if that is something, some exercise, it's hard, but if some sort of an exercise that the participant can do, then I think we can be able to, the researcher will be able to kind of minimize as much as possible the conflict of interest. It's tough.
I agree.
Yeah, I'll take a little bit of a different stand. I agree completely with what Pritish is saying. And it is really a part of the design of the research, and it starts actually from there. Nowadays, I have seen the pattern of research and research, even the research calls, or when there is opening for grant proposals and all that. One of the things that most of the calls ask for is to address something which is called as theory of change and research for impact. Like, you are proposing this research, but how does it going to make any impact on, and what kind of impact it is going to bring, right? So that is where the thinking starts with the researcher, that what is my theory of change, and that is how that shapes the goals of that research. What is it that the research is going to achieve? Are there goals and multiple goals and sub goals, and whatever it is, they are very closely linked with the theory of change and research for impact, right? So there is a whole lot of exercise that the researchers usually do at the time of the proposal itself. And the time comes when the researchers actually have to go back and feed it back to the participants, saying that, with all the data that you have, information and data that you have shared with me, this is what we have found, and this is what we think that is going to be the impact, and which is either beneficial, or whether it is going to take some time, or whether it is immediate, whether it is intermediary. If the projects are long, like for example 4 or 5 years long, it happens that there are intermittent kind of a benefits and impact that the participants themselves experience, right? So when you draft the theory of change, when you talk about your research for impact, that is when you have eliminated, and if the exercise has happened rigorously, as Pritish was pointing it out, that is where you eliminate lots of conflicts of interest. Because when the either individual researcher or a group of researchers come together to talk about this proposal and the grant and everything, there are so many different interests that each discipline brings with, the researchers will bring with. And there could be a possibility of conflict of interest when the research has progressed, the project has gone ahead and done lots of data collection and interpretation of the data, and it has resulted in certain change of policies or schemes or any kind of new interventions or something like that, which could be either beneficial or or kind of uh, to only very few set of people, and that kind of a thing might be happening. But with eliminating the conflict of interest right at the beginning of the project helps a lot. um, and that actually becomes really different than what you are feeding back to the participant. um, you might tell the participant, and this is the repeated kind of a question from participants or stakeholders or respondents we keep getting when we go for data collection, is that you are collecting all this data, you are taking all the information, what am I going to get in return? What is it that you are going to give back, right? And that is where also ethics come into consideration. How are you going to answer this question? What is it that you are really looking at as your research is going to go to impact stage, and how it is going to happen, how long it is going to take when they will realize, or when they will be benefited by that impact. All those things need to be playing in when you answer that question to even group of participants or your respondents, right? So I think it's totally different in terms of what we call it as conflict of interest and feeding back to the participant. I don't know if I complicated it a little more or simplified it. Yeah.
I think some complications are always good because life is not as simple as we want it to be.
Yeah.
On that note, I think the participants are still digesting all of this. So I have one more thing to say, which no, I also share that because of paucity of time, it's not always possible to do justice to the backgrounds of the speakers. Both of our speakers are actually from fairly interdisciplinary, have made a lot of leaps across their careers in terms of academic disciplines, and so they bring a lot of depth and knowledge of multiple disciplines in their work. Which is why I want you to also, if you can think and tell us a little more about, and again, I'm going back to what Sheetal said about the role of language in qualitative research. Um, and that's my own background is a literature professor, even though I don't do too much of it anymore. But I do often think about, the role, because in all qualitative research, we are using language. Its narrative structure. So do you think there is an emphasis on the inherent slippages of narrative? If because all language is slippery, right? You can't really. It's impossible to box words into neat categories. So sort of does that also come into play when studies are being designed and carried out, especially in terms of how the output is being designed? When there are field interviews and you write a long sort of notes on what people said and you can sort of interpret that. How does that process play out in your research?
Pritish, go ahead.
Uh, yeah, so yeah, difficult question. But I think it does play a role. I really don't have a direct and linear answer to that. But I think language does play a role, which that is something that I think I have reflected upon a bit in terms of, depends on how. Um, so it also starts like, are you, starts depend. So I also feel that there's a language in which you think, right? And so that also brings in um, um a bit of angle to it, and also I also see the the which language you're using in terms of when you in terms of how you think when you use a particular language to talk to the participant, and in which language you are actually drafting it. So the least I can do is I admit that yes, there could be those slippages and biases in terms of which language that we use, and there are instances where you need to have someone with you who can translate it. So all of that. But yeah, I mean, at this point of time, I can only admit that yes, language, does play a big role in terms of how you interpret that data, and how you interpret, and how then again how it comes out of you when you actually draft it and write it and take it back. So yes.
Thanks. And Shika, you have anything to say to
Yeah,
that?
I agree completely that, if you completely ignore this part of language, and how it actually influences or changes the narrative of the interpretation that you are going to do, because it has two different things. One is during the data collection itself, what kind of role it plays and why it is important. Because as Pritish said, people think in certain language, but when you are talking to somebody else and responding to their questions, it may not be exactly the same because you are talking to them maybe in a different language or different situations or context that you are sitting and talking. So that also has a lot of influence and a lot of impact on how the narrative or how the response might change, right? So every time there is a guideline or there is a guidebook when some researcher is going to collect data in a qualitative terms, is that where do you interview the respondent? Are there people around that respondent when you are interviewing them? Is it a interview only with one person in the household, or it has to be a entire household together? All those guidelines, which language do you use, which time of the day do you go for interview, um, you know um, what is other different features of that respondent, in the sense that the age of the respondent, education, marital status, and many different things, right? So, and also many a times, because I now work on the research which is related to climate change, it also becomes really important which part of the year are you going to do these interviews. For example, when you want to talk about heat and extreme heat conditions, if you go in winter, you're going to get really different answers. And when you go into summer, you are going to get different answers. So the language, when it comes to this situation, is that when the respondent, when the interviewer, or when the researcher is not comfortable with that language that the respondent is going to talk about, that is why, yeah, translator is important. But I suggest to my researchers that as far as possible, don't rely on translators. Even that becomes another filter for you, for getting that first hand kind of information, right? And many a times we suggest that the interviews are recorded, but that also again becomes an ethical issue, that where do you want to stay, how do you store these recordings, how do you secure it, how do you make sure that you don't disclose the identity who is speaking, even if it is audio interview. So that actually helps us in bringing the exact narrations, if we are able to do the audio recording. But still, when a researcher talks to a respondent in a different circumstances, they they also have certain limitations on use of words, right? What kind of words they want to use, what kind of gestures they can do. As we follow some ethical kind of practices, even the respondents also follow, that we shouldn't be forgetting. So many a times, what happens is we really record also, along with the language, along with the narration, along with the quotations that we get from respondents, the gestures, the gestures by other people who are present there, or like, if at all there is some kind of a link with uh, any kind of support or any kind of biases that the participant may have. So that is one part of it when we do data collection. And the language of interpretation also becomes important, because Pritish will know that when you do a policy brief and when you do an academic paper from the same findings that you have from your qualitative research, both the languages are totally very, very different. It may mean the same. It may really give the clear message, but totally different kind of a language in the sense like, how it is played, how it is articulated, how persuasive it is for the policy brief, and how convincing and rigorous it is for academic literature. Both of them matter a lot, I think, in the qualitative research.
Thanks a lot, Sheetal. I think we are at time, so I'm really sort of sorry to not have further discussion happening. But yeah, please allow me to thank both of you, Sheetal and Pritish, for taking out time for this, and all the participants who also took up time and attended this session. There was a question in the chat Q&A box which I've attempted to answer. Unfortunately, again, since we're out of time, we won't be able to take more questions. I hope this session was as enjoyable to you as it was for me to listen to. And thank you. Have a good rest of the day. Good evening.
It was.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Thanks
you.
for having us. Yeah.